There were truly grim scenes last night in Southport. What should have been a moment of mourning and grief after the horrific murder of 3 little girls became a far-right riot. And you can see the aftermath of that riot in video footage. A mosque was targeted, bricks thrown, cars set on fire amidst anti-Muslim chants. Online disinformation and misinformation earlier spread false claims that the suspect was an asylum seeker, that he'd arrived recently on a boat, that he was Muslim. In actual fact, we know he's 17 years old, British born, and in the words of the BBC, has no known links to Islam. Because he's under 18, he can't be identified, but this has been presented as a conspiracy. Now, of course, if he had been a Muslim, it would have been no more acceptable to riot. Blaming the group for the actions of an individual is, of course, straightforward racism. Now, I want to know what drives these rioters. Who are they? What's it all about? I also want to know about the politicians and media outlets in the mainstream who have fanned the flames and led us to this point. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to be joined by the brilliant expert Joe Mulhall. He's Director of Research at Hope Not Hate, which focuses on the far right. So Joe, first of all, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me.
Can you just tell me, who were the people rioting on the streets of Southport after an horrific and hideous crime, 3 little girls killed, and grief, mourning? That's what this should have been about. Instead, we saw bricks flying and anti-Muslim chants outside a mosque. What the hell happened?
So, I mean, what was really tragic is within moments of that horrifying attack happening on Monday, we started to see misinformation being spread by the far right. We started to see far right individuals spreading disinformation, especially essentially claiming that this was a Muslim, that it was maybe someone that had come over on a boat. Even fake names or false names were being circulated. And so we started to see a huge amount of energy within the far right, whipping up tensions, causing all sorts of problems. And very soon, by about 6 o'clock on Monday evening, we already started seeing calls for demonstrations, separate demonstrations to the very peaceful vigil that happened yesterday for a few hours later. And of course, we knew very early on that they were going to be targeting the mosque. Now, the people on the evening, in terms of who they are, we're still going through the footage, of course we are, going clip by clip, but it was a range. Most of the people there had travelled from within the Merseyside region, or some from within the northwest, but there were figures that we're already picking up from very traditional far-right groups like Patriotic Alternative, or individuals within the orbit of Tommy Robinson that did travel some distances to go to the demonstration itself. So it's one of those difficult situations whereby it's too simplistic to say that this is groups of far-right activists that have been bussed in from around the country, but it's also not, it wasn't like a spontaneous local event either.
The English Defence League, the spectre of the English Defence League has been raised, but to be clear, the EDL, which Tommy Robinson left in 2013, has basically just disappeared and fragmented as a cohesive force since then, hasn't it?
Absolutely. There's been some really quite odd chatter about the English Defence League. There's been calls to ban the English Defence League. There's been saying that this was caused by the English Defence League. But as you say, it doesn't exist as an organisation anymore. It started in 2009. Tommy Robinson left in 2013. It dribbled on for several years. But as an organisation, it doesn't exist. That's not, of course, to say that many of the individuals that went through the English Defence League that were radicalised in that style of anti-Muslim politics aren't still around and aren't still engaging in activism. And actually, what's really clear from what we see on the footage from last night, there was chanting, or pro-Tommy Robinson chanting, and much of the rhetoric that was being chanted by the crowd is indistinguishable from the exact same sloganeering that we heard from Tommy Robinson at the demonstration in London on Saturday. What we've seen is ostensibly, while it is no longer a formal organisation with memberships and regional structures, there is now thousands of individuals that are essentially part of these networks, primarily online. And what we saw yesterday was what can happen when those online networks spill out onto the road.
So, I mean, I'm quite interested in terms of, because for a while you had the kind of this far-right milieu which latched onto the Leave cause after the referendum. So this was when things got very polarised in Britain over the referendum campaign. I've had my experience with those people. They, gathered around Parliament and so on. I know we're talking about people on Merseyside here, but I'm just talking about this kind of, these sorts of kind of groups, individuals, and then a lot of them were radicalised over COVID as well, or then shifted onto kind of anti-vax sort of stuff. Is that kind of is that the sorts of milieus we're talking about here, the sorts of people who latched onto those different causes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that, the event that happened last night, we have to put it in the context of, say, the massive Tommy Robinson demonstration, for example, in London on Saturday that had 20,000, maybe even 30,000 people on it. And if you look at what was being talked about on the stage, yes, of course, it was the traditional Tommy Robinson stuff. It was about Muslims. It was about asylum seekers. It was about immigrant populations. But it was also about vaccines. It was about COVID. It was about, the World Health Organization. During the pandemic, we started to see a lot of these disparate, groups and movements online coagulate together. They're based around this very populist idea that there is some sort of corrupt elite which is taking on these pure people and being oppressed. We've started to mean that the networks that people like Tommy Robinson are tapping into are much more diverse. And yet last night, when you look at it, there was a range of individuals that we can pick up already from there. There was the very traditional Tommy Robinson supporter types there. There was people that came from the traditional football hooligan world that had mobilized quite strongly, and some of them traveled in. And then we also saw individuals from the explicitly fascist patriotic alternative there as well. So it was a kind of range across the far right. And you're absolutely right to mention conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories is central to this idea. Part of the narrative that was really important was that, of course, there was this fake news about this guy being a Muslim or somehow being an asylum seeker. But it was also that we're being lied to, and this populist idea that we're being lied to. And that's, as a result, you can't trust when the police say this person is not an Islamist, this person is not, the attacker is not a Muslim. They just discard that information. So conspiracy theories is at the heart of this as well.
So you get this misinformation pumped out, and it's believed, and then when it's contradicted, that's a cover-up. I mean, that's basically what they're doing, isn't it? I'm interested obviously social media, and particularly under Elon Musk, Twitter, as we should just call it, calling it X is ridiculous. But I mean, that's obviously, it's got worse and worse and worse. It's become a real cesspit of misinformation, disinformation, far-right conspiracism. It's a mess. But I think it's quite easy just to, a lot of people just say social media and this is real world effects. I mean, let's just take Islamophobia. I mean, Islamophobia is Baroness Saidavasi, the most prominent Muslim conservative politician. She said years ago, back in 2011, it passed the dinner table test. That become mainstream, and the polling is quite clear about this. Actually, it shows polling in the past has shown a huge number of the population think that Islam is incompatible with the British way of life. About a third, I think, said that a few years ago. Interestingly, a third of Britons in 2019 thought Islam was a threat to the British way of life. That's about 20 million British adults. It's an astonishing large number of people, that. But also, other polling suggests it was actually more predominant, Islamophobia more widespread actually amongst middle-class people than working class people, I suppose, who's more likely to live in mixed areas. But what do you think is the point is Islamophobia is a very mainstream, respectable bigotry. So it's not surprising you get the most radicalized elements who are desperate every time anything happens to go. They're prey. You can see them. They're desperate for that person to be a Muslim, aren't they? They're just crossing everything.
Hugely right. And this context is central to understanding what's going on. And it reminds me a little bit of you might remember the Knowsley riot that happened last year, again, outside accommodation housing asylum seekers. A lot of the focus around that was look at the misinformation and disinformation being spread. One of the questions, though, is why do people believe it? Why is it that when people hear this fake news and this disinformation, do they presume that it's correct? And part of that has to be understanding the context in which societal Islamophobia, the normalization of racism and Islamophobia has become so prominent. The Conservative Party and the last government is a great example of that, but it's also huge sections of our political class, it's huge sections of our media class as well. And I think what's really important to understand here is that the far right, yes, we can focus on it, but we shouldn't make it a comforting thing. It's sometimes comforting to say these things happen because a small group of far right activists have been bussed in from somewhere and done this thing. The far right is not a tumor, a cancerous tumor that hangs off our body politic. And if we just lop it off, everything's fine. The far right is a gangrenous limb that is within the body politic, that is poisoning it, but also living off it. And I think it's really, really important to place that context in there. The reason that so many people turned up at Tommy Robinson's demonstration, the reason that 4 million people voted for Nigel Farage and reform at the last general election, the reason that so many people listened to this fake news in Southport and decided to turn around and to target a mosque for no apparent reason, was because so much is the underlying Islamophobia that sits at the heart of this. And that's because you can read that Islamophobia in a mainstream newspaper, and we heard it from our Home Secretary in Parliament, and we hear it in things like GB News, The Spectator, The Telegraph, The Sun. It is that wider context that makes people believe the lies that are being spread online.
So, I mean, as an example, a 2019 study, I'd be interested to see that updated, suggested 59% of newspaper stories relating to Muslims had negative themes. Mail on Sunday was the top of the pack. There was 78%. I mean, examples, Boris Johnson, when he compared the Muslim women wearing the veil to letterboxes and bank robbers, Islamophobic incidents surged by 375%. So these, and what you mentioned, the Spectator, Rod Liddell, for example, one of their star columnists wrote, "There's not enough Islamophobia in the Conservative Party." So that shows it's respectable. It's fanned by politicians and media outlets.
Oh, well, absolutely. And of course, we heard Lord Pearson in the House of Lords saying the most extreme kind of forms of Islamophobia just last week. And it goes back to that point, which is we spend a lot of time trying to look at and trying to trace the origin of things like the misinformation about saying why this person is a Muslim. And that is important to understand how that process happens. But the real question is why people believe it. And actually, one of the reason that we saw such misinformation about this person supposedly being a Muslim happen so quickly after the attack is because so many people on social media presumed that was the case. They are predisposed when they see this horrifying attack, this murderous attack on children. Well, this must be a Muslim. This must be an asylum seeker. This must be a migrant. And so that's one of the triggers that means that this misinformation spreads so quickly, is because people just retweet it without checking. They don't wait for the information because there's a presumption that there is the Muslim populace, it will be a Muslim. And as a result, that justifies in their minds, when there's this horrifying attack, to go and attack a mosque, because there is collective responsibility of the Muslim community in their eyes.
We saw that, in fact, recently as well, when the BBC radio commentator John Hunt's wife and 2 daughters killed in horrific circumstances, and quickly people jumped to that hoping that it was a Muslim suspect, which it wasn't at all. Just another thing I just wanted to talk to you just finally about is, I guess this is broader phenomenon. It's very much not specific in Britain. It's actually a lot worse in other countries, which is, I suppose there was supposed to be, since World War II, a cordon sanitaire between the centre right and what lies beyond it. And in Europe, that really, I suppose, began to fall apart. I'd say in Austria at the end of the 20th century, when the Christian Democrats formed a coalition with the far-right Freedom Party. I remember I was a teenager, I went to protest outside the Austrian embassy. It was a big deal at the time. But since then, the far-right have entered power in multiple countries. We got some better results in France, but I wouldn't, as a betting man, you wouldn't bet against the far right taking over there in the not too distant future. They're ahead in Austria, in Germany, thriving like they've never thrived since the fall of Hitler. Italy, we could go on. Trump in America, the Republican Party basically taken over by the far right. Mm-hmm. And here you get the likes of Suella Braverman, who talking about how the Islamists are in charge in Britain. This is in response to, squaring, demonizing Gaza protests, calling them violent, but that there's not many being arrested. That's her conspiracy theory. Liz Truss, a former Conservative Prime Minister, saying there's a deep state out to get her. And then various GB News, Talk TV presenters, outright some of them just dalliances with the likes of that whole Tommy Robinson orbit. It is eroding, isn't it? And I just wonder, is that what makes this different? That you actually, before actually these would have been quite isolated, but they're not actually as isolated as they once were.
Look, I think there's a few things to say here. I think you make a really interesting point. When Jörg Haider won those elections, there was protests. You say you went on one. There was protests in New York. There was protests around the world. There was horror that this was happening. And then in the last French elections, there's a celebration. But actually, if you look at the vote, National Rally's vote there and how much it's dramatically increased in the last 10, 15 years, we're increasingly celebrating situations that even just a decade before would have been utterly incomprehensible. So that's the first bit. The second bit is that there was exceptions to this rising far right. There used to be, people would say Germany was the exception because of its history.
Spain,
in Germany, we've got elections coming up in a few months, or in fact, less than that, where the AfD are polling over 30%. The Iberian Peninsula was an exception because of its new democracies. Now we've got Vox and Chega. Sweden was an exception because of its liberal past. We've got Sweden Democrats. And it's remarkably, you can still find newspaper articles in the UK that say Britain is the exception. We've been arguing at Hope Not Hate for quite some time that the same radical right rising has been happening here, partly because of our electoral system, though it's been constrained. And what we saw was the radicalization of the right Conservative Party, whereby the last, lots of members of the government, in fact, in the last Conservative administration were ideologically indistinguishable from those European radical right parties. And we had an emergence of an ecosystem around them, the think tanks, the conferences, things like GB News. We've had the same phenomenon happening in the UK that we've had in those European countries, but in one sense, we've been protected, if you will, if that's the right term, throughout the electoral system, or at least blinded by it. And of course, now in the last general election, the reform vote suggests that we have had exactly the same thing. And so I think this is really important. Any kind of idea that there is some British exceptionalism here, that we're not having the same phenomenon happen here, is comforting, but it's nonsensical. We are watching it here. And of course, it's happening in the same way. It's in the mainstream. It's based on prejudice, discrimination. And it is, I genuinely believe this, in lots of parts of Europe and also here, there is a threat to the liberal democratic order and the institutions of liberal democracy, the notions of universal human rights. We are facing a serious challenge here. 4 million votes for reform is something that many people would have thought incomprehensible just 6 months ago, let alone 10 years ago.
And just lastly on that, sorry, I forgot to say, Nigel Farage yesterday posted a video on social media where he did this quite, I'd say, slimy, plausible deniability, where he would air allegations being circulated. Of course, I don't know if they're true, but he was there. He's an MP now. He's got that respectable kind of imprint after his name. So he actually helped legitimize these rumors while saying, I'm only asking questions. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty appalling. It's hard to say that you can be shocked by Farage anymore. I mean, during the last election, Mark Collett, the leader of the fascist group Patriotic Alternative, said much of what Farage is saying is more extreme than we felt we could get away with in the BNP in 2010. And yet, what he said yesterday will still remain shocking in a few ways. As you say, he's now in the House of Parliament. If you really wanted answers to those questions, there's ways he can now get answers to those questions, not least going in and asking a question in Parliament. But he chose not to do that. He chose to amplify misinformation and disinformation. It was a nod and a wink. Last Saturday in London, when those 20,000, 30,000 people were in Trafalgar Square with Tommy Robinson, lots of the speakers said, we are your constituency. Where are you, Farage? And you have to place his comments in that context. This was a nod and a wink to the far right to turn around and say, it's plausibly deniable. I'm not spreading this. I'm not saying it's true, but I'm questioning the official narrative. And I'm saying, is this person on an MI6 watch list, which of course is very thinly coded language for, is this person Muslim? And I think it's extraordinarily dangerous that an individual like that is now in Parliament.
Joe, brilliant stuff, disturbing stuff. For everyone listening or watching, press like, subscribe, do leave your comments. Love to hear your thoughts. But Joe, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, honestly, for your insight.
Thanks for having me.